appropriate for the occasion. So, good evenings, everybody. I would like to welcome you to our Friday webinar series. As you know, that Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare is a policy-oriented think tank in NCR area. And as you already know, that we have been conducting these webinars on very important and contemporary issues for more than 2 years. We have been very fortunate. We have made an attempt and very fortunate that we have been successful in that, having a blend of speakers from India and abroad to come and talk to us. So that gives us a global perspective on various issues. It's in that very context that we are having this webinar today. It's a burning topic. The world is on the cusp of probably a global recession, and everybody is worried about it. And you know, the interest rate cycle is so aggressively gone the other side that probably the recession is being invited now. So, given that situation, we are today here to discuss, can India avoid this global recession? To discuss this issue, we have a very illustrious panel. We have Dr. Ejaz Ghani from the World Bank, former advisor. We have two professors from our own country, Professor Bijoy and Professor Bezbaruah. And to chair this session is Dr. Ashima Goyal. She's been a professor, but more importantly, she has a complete picture of the economy because she has been in the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and now she's in the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank. So she's absolutely abreast with the developments that have been taking place. She has been very active in research. She has published nearly 100 articles in refereed journals, in national and international journals. She has important books to her credit. The most important book that I look at is a concise handbook of the Indian economy. I said most important because I could not contribute a chapter there. That is why. And then she has been a consultant to all the major multinational institutions, including ADB and the World Bank and UNSCAP. And she has worked with the RBI for many years and contributed lots of good research in RBI. She has been awarded 2 Best Research Awards at GDN meetings at Tokyo in 2000 and Rio de Janeiro in 2001. She was selected as one of the 4 most powerful women in economics, a thought leader, by Business Today in 2008. Was the first Professor P.R. Brahmananda Memorial Research Grant awardee for a study on, this is very important, on history of monetary policy in India since independence, 2011. And this was published by Springer in 2014. So she has been on the Indian economy for a very long time. So we thought she would be the best person to chair this session, share her thoughts with us, as well as guide and navigate the discussion in the area so that we all learn at the end of this. So with this, I invite Dr. and Professor Ashima Goyal to take over the session and share her thoughts as well as bring us the panel discussion. Professor Goyal, please.
Thank you, Dr. Singh, for your kind words, for the invitation, and for setting up this, as you have set up so many interesting panels and lectures. So I'm delighted to welcome 3 learned scholars, each with a large body of work. Dr. Ghani is Economic Advisor, World Bank, whose recent work on urbanization and India's youth advantage is very well known. Professor Bezbaruah and Bijoykumar Singh, both working in specializing on the Northeast, and both are ex-Delhi school students. I was delighted to learn that since I'm also from Delhi school. So double welcome to both of you. And we will have a more detailed introduction as I invite them to speak. But first, just a few remarks I will make. So this topic is very interesting and highly debated. My own view in short is that we are globally interlinked. So There will be some effect, but it is possible to withstand and continue to do well depending on policy. And what gives me some confidence is that India has done relatively well under these pluri-shocks in the past 2 years. And this outperformance is not just due to base effects. For example, people would say 22, we had the highest rate of growth in the world almost, because this higher growth was higher than countries that had worse dips, so should have had more of a base effects. So there is a very critical view of India and its performance. This is largely sort of ideological, and one sort of statement one often hears is that India has fundamental problems and major reforms are required, and growth is not possible without fundamental reforms, and therefore under global crisis it's just not possible. It's the global kind of ship that pulls the Indian economy. And the argument is made pointing to the slowdown of the last decade. But the fact that we've had a very good recovery in a crisis period suggests that we need to rethink this view and look at the data more carefully. So I have a couple of papers where I've tried to do this. And my own view is that that past slowdown was driven by very severe monetary financial tightening in response to global shocks. And there was a cost of some reforms. And we saw that with the reversal of the liquidity squeeze in 2019, I've looked at some early high frequency data into 2020 before the pandemic hit, and you saw a recovery starting. But so one major reason the economy did well through the pluri shocks was that for the first time, monetary fiscal policy was counter-cyclical, liquidity conditions were eased, and financial conditions also became easier. And there was no overreaction. And unfortunately, after the global financial crisis, we had too much stimulus. So overreaction in macroeconomic policies. And then after the euro debt crisis, we had double deficits and vulnerability. There was too much tightening. So this time, I'm getting an echo. Is audio okay? So there is a lot of policy pragmatism. Policy looked at both the supply and demand side. While many global major economies, there was excess demand stimulus. And at the same time, reforms were continued with supply side improvements, focusing on empowering people, providing assets, improving regulations, corporate governance, formalization, tax reform, better data, and most important, public digital innovations that enable the very good vaccination spread and other UPI. India has had tremendous growth in this. Digitization got a fillip from the pandemic, and that suited what had been done here and the kind of skills available. So monetary policy was counter-cyclical. Major regulatory relief was provided, but it was time-barred. So in line with reforms, it did not create poor incentives. There was early quantitative tightening from April 21. And this was a precondition for raising repo rates because our repo rates continued to be positive. They were 4%. With excess liquidity, they would have fallen below that. Then there was appropriate front loading of repo rate hikes after the Ukraine war and the major oil and other food price shocks. Although inflation had been rising earlier because of the global supply chains and rise in costs. So when I say counter-cyclical, I think the lesson learned was that India needs to smooth global shocks, not aggravate them. And we have the space to do this. For example, an economy in transition, growth rates tend to be high. And we know that famous snowball effect that was used in the West to justify very large spending, which says that as long as the real rate of interest is less than the rate of growth, debt ratios fall. and the government can afford to spend more. Now, this condition is normally met in a country like India, but there is huge volatility in interest rates. We saw this through the last decade, and that hurt investment and growth recoveries. Moreover, in India, we don't have a tight labor market. We have unemployment. And so there are no second round effects of inflation. The inflation that we've been seeing is due to multiple supply shocks. And the exchange rate is market determined, but there is intervention to prevent large overshooting, which happens in emerging markets, and large deviations from fundamental real rates. Because we are told to follow US monetary tightening, but the excess demand is in the US, not elsewhere. If we allow large depreciation due to outflows and so on, it leads to inflation, requires a repo rate rise under inflation targeting. So you fall into a tightening trap. You're forced to follow the Fed. But we did well earlier because fiscal policy did not follow excess stimulus in the US. And monetary policy also should not. It should respond to domestic inflation and use degrees of freedom that are available from the capital flow management, since we don't have full capital account convertibility. We have reserves, we can use macroprudential policy, etc. Fiscal policy expenditure was very well targeted. We had large food stocks which were used for free distribution to the less well-off. Oil, since oil taxes were not on international crude oil, taxes were not raised when oil prices fell. They could be cut when oil prices rose under the pandemic and the supply shocks. We had CPI inflation, which we were targeting in the Reserve Bank, much below wholesale price inflation. Because of this, the domestic prices did not rise as much as international. The pass-through from firms was also less to consumer prices. And the government also focused on increasing the share of investment, which has multiplier effects and improves the supply side. So overall, the focus on the supply side, reducing costs, the logistics reform, keeping food prices low, prevented the second round effect to wages and so on, and allowed excellent monetary fiscal coordination where real rates could be kept somewhat low to encourage growth while responding to inflation. The second major reason I think the economy did well was in a way our bad luck led to good luck. As I said, over the last decade, after the overreaction in stimulus and over tightening, we had quantitative tightening through the 2010s, very tight monetary financial conditions. And our corporates were deleveraging, reforms in the financial sector. And while internationally huge leverage was built up under quantitative easing, here there was surprise. Many international agencies there was an expectation that the financial sector had performed so poorly over the last decade and it would collapse under the pluri shocks. But banks did very well. Capital adequacy was improved. All their risk, asset quality, etc., was improved. And over here we have broad regulation. So NBFCs also are regulated shadow banks. Unlike in the major source countries of capital flows, we are seeing a lot of the flows coming to emerging markets now the surges are not due to cross-border bank flows, because bank regulation was really improved after the global financial crisis, but it is shadow banks. And obviously there would be arbitrage. So we've seen fault lines in the US, for example, in the UK, pension funds and were implicated. And I think the Bank of England made it very useful when people say that there are huge global risks out there possible as the QT progresses, which could create spillovers for emerging markets. I think the Bank of England showed that you need to respond to these cracks and fault lines if something blows up, but you can make a distinction between market making and monetary policy. so that even as you are tightening against inflation, you can support the financial sector. And I think in India, we have the room to do this and keep financial conditions somewhat easy to support growth. The final point I would like to flag, the reason I think India can do somewhat better and has done better in the past, is what I call the double diversity advantage. So we have domestic diversity because we are a large economy, and also because we are at different levels of development in different sectors. So there's correlation is low. And this means that if one sector is doing badly, the other might be doing better. And the average is not so bad. So we saw this during the pandemic lockdowns when industry absolute zero, but agriculture was doing well. And under a rural road building program, agricultural exports are really growing substantially. And diversification towards horticulture, fisheries, etc., is progressing well. And then the pandemic gave a boost to digitization and outsourcing, which today, when the world is slowing, we are seeing that our software exports are doing very well because there is a substantial demand there, and because firms are economizing, they're not going to cut that demand. Another thing we are seeing is exports are slowing, but remittance inflows are really expanding, rising. And this normally we see after a period of high oil prices, remittances increase to the Indian economy. So these are all ways in which we are naturally diversified. Another example is normally when you have large outflows, as we saw in the Fed tightening in the initial months, stock markets indices used to collapse. This time, the households are diversifying into mutual funds. There's continual investment through SIPs, and Indian stock markets remain robust. And now we are seeing inflows returning to India in July, while emerging markets, they started coming back in November. So that shows ultimately whatever the Reserve Bank intervention and so on, since the rupee is globally determined, it's determined by global inflows and in free markets. So it has to be the sort of confidence in the rupee that meant that the rupee has performed better than many other currencies. And then apart from domestic diversity, we have global diversity, because the pandemic has given this big lesson that it's dangerous to be over dependent on any one country. In India, we were worried because all our pharmaceutical APIs had gone to China. We were worried whether we would be able to provide drugs under the COVID. So we are seeing this in many countries as a move towards industrial policy. So in India, supply chains are looking at coming to India away from China. And the government had this PLI policy that subsidizes manufacturing for exports. And people are worried that this is going back towards the policy of import substitution and distorting prices. But I like to say that this is export competition, not import substitution. It should be, it's well run, temporary and targeted, but it needs to build up an industrial ecosystem. Even the US is doing this now to bring semiconductors back to the US. So you need to have some sustained support for some time. And so with all this, and as we have our demography, large youth, I think Dr. Ghani will talk about this. So there are huge risks out there. One thing, sometimes people say that the world has changed drastically. The era of cheap money, cheap labor, and cheap energy is over, and inflation rates will settle higher. There'll be too much demand for investment compared to too little investment earlier because of the move to net zero, etc. But I think in India, we've seen that our inflation rates have come down, average rates. And we always had much higher rates compared to the rest of the world. So the rest of the world is going to be higher. Maybe we'll have less differential and our rupee will need to depreciate less to correct in real terms. And we have another big risk for us is the current account deficit because of our oil dependence. But here again, we have multiple instruments. And overall, this move towards net zero, there's some already about 9% switch towards green energy, and overall long-term import substitution away from oil will be good for the economy. export promotion measures, etc. And I would say that another big risk is climate change. We've seen a lot of change and how vulnerable we are to this. But again, we are we have very different ecological zones through the economy. And so a lot of work needs to be done and is happening on improving food supply chains and the food economy and moving towards more robust crops such as millets and so on. So we need to be prepared, but we have shown that we can handle shocks with appropriate smoothing policies. We could perhaps do better, even if shocks continue. So now, with these remarks, I will turn to Dr. Ghani to make his presentation and tell us the view from outside, looking in. He has worked on many countries and economic issues. He has been a consultant at ILO, UNCTAD, UNICEF. He has edited several books, including Reshaping Tomorrow, Is South Asia Ready for the Big Leap? So are we ready? Are we in the process of the big leap now? We will hear from him. But then he's also written about the poor 500 million in South Asia. So are we going to, can they take part in the big leap? And then the service revolution in South Asia. So the digital and how this is giving us a benefit. He has a PhD from Oxford University, studied in St. Stephen's College in JNU in India, and he is an INLAC scholar. Dr. Ghani, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Ashima. Thank you, Charan. You have summed it up beautifully already. So you have given a lot of thoughts and raised a lot of questions. So what I'm going to do is try and take your thoughts and take it to provoke a bit more questions on the analysis you have done. My first question is, all the policies that you mentioned which has helped India to sustain high growth, to the best of my knowledge, is also being followed in USA, Europe, China. They've had very accommodating fiscal policy for a long time. The US central bank is being criticized for being too late in intervening to lower the inflation rate. So if the other countries have also followed the same policies that India has, why is India escaping the global downturn? My second question that I raise is, we have to be very careful when we say we are escaping the global downturn. We may not have. If we move out from the growth effect to the base effect, the work that Arvind Subramanian did was, despite high growth, the level of GDP today is a bit lower than what it was before pandemic. It's not only that, there is also rising concern that global recession will be worse next year. So it's too early to conclude that everything is hunky-dory. It will get worse. So given the fact that the House is divided and that India has followed more or less similar macroeconomic policies as US and Europe, why should India do better? I'm raising these as questions. I don't have the answers. I mean, I just want to understand it better. I have given some of the reasons: demographics, new source of growth, agenda, but maybe this time I'm going to look at it differently. And I'm not suggesting this as conclusions, but just for the discussion purposes. Might it be the case that a fast pace of rural development is enabling India to grow much faster. And that kind of rural development will not find it in Europe and USA. Let me elaborate a bit more on what I mean by rural development. Late Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee introduced the concept of Golden Quadrilateral Highway, which connected the north, south, east, west. And along the highway, small cities developed, and that accelerated the pace of structural transformation as India's dependence on agriculture reduced and on more productive manufacturing and services sector it took off. So the first question is India benefiting from a fast pace of rural structural transformation? My second question is that India is generating a large number of entrepreneurs, much more so than USA, China, and Europe. The number of, I don't have the recent data, but the number of new enterprises being established in India is growing immensely. And from the work we did on 600 districts in India using ASI NSS data, it clearly showed that the greater the number of new enterprises being established at the district level, the faster is the economic growth. And we also asked the question, why do enterprises locate where they locate? They are not so much impacted by short-term fluctuations. The major factor that generates entrepreneurship at the district level is the level of investment in physical and human infrastructure. If a city or a district or a state has better physical and human infrastructure, it generates many more entrepreneurs and it supports growth. So I'm raising this as questions, not as solutions. But it might be the case that the pace of India's structural transformation has accelerated thanks to the investments made in the past. The number of new enterprises has scaled up, and that is being sustained. And the third question that I want to bring up, India has a large informal sector. And India also has the participation of women in the labor force is very low. But over the last decade, gender and informality may be playing a bigger role in India's growth agenda. When we examined the informal sector and compared it with the formal sector and asked which one is globally integrated, we found that the small informal enterprises exploded in the tradable sector, not the large formal enterprises. So the small informal enterprises, largely headed by women, have now become part of the global supply chain. A lot of people will dismiss this by saying they have poor productivity growth, but it can't be that bad if you have become an integral part of the global supply chain. So I just want to raise these three questions: what kind of role have they played in sustaining India's growth? Rural transformation, rise of entrepreneurship, and improved gender equality. These three things don't hold so much in USA, Europe, and China, but India may be benefiting from it. Let me stop here. We will carry on with more questions.
You want me to respond to some of these questions before going to the other panelists?
So, you deal it with the way you want to. If I may stop and we can come up later. Yeah, please go ahead and respond.
Yeah, so it's current. I think it'll be better that way. First, I think that our monetary fiscal policies were not like US and China. In the sense, the US, it was regarded as a pure, demand shock. People are not working, not earning. You give them huge transfers. While in India, there was an awareness that there's a lockdown, the supply side is also affected. So there was some DBT transfers made initially to women, but it was small amount. And after that, it was decided to continue reforms, improve the supply side, rather than give a pure demand stimulus. So there was a lot of criticism over here, with people saying the government is not supporting the poor, etc. And this is ridiculous. Unless demand increases, supply will not increase. So to focus on the supply side is wrong. But I think there was overall, because today, since India always had a higher debt ratio and very high share of interest payments. So today, the same people are now saying the deficit, the debt levels are so high. Debt ratio increased to about 90. It was around 70 or so on. But over the last year, because of high growth, this is what I'm saying, that snowball effect, the debt ratio has come down to around 80. So, so it was good that there was, and also the realization that this pandemic might last long, there might be multiple shocks, you need to conserve energy. No, while I think in the US there was overspending, overstimulus, and this is what led to this huge inflationary pressures at a time when you have supply side bottlenecks and supply chains have collapsed. You're going to give this huge demand stimulus, and people were ordering exercisers and etc. from China. The seas were just choked. And the whole world is suffering from high inflation now, partly because of this kind of policy. There was overstimulus. So in India, I think it was, and the other very different fact in India, this whole last decade, there was this idea of central bank independence and monetary and inflation targeting means total central bank independence. They should not even talk to the fiscal authorities, and any discussion means pressure and so on. But in India, because the target is CPI inflation, and more than 50% of this is food. So it's a supply side, and what happens to food prices, where the fiscal, as you were saying, the development of the rural areas, increasing productivity, etc., plays a much larger role. And I mentioned certain supply side measures that were taken that kept our inflation low. For example, this free food provision, using the large food stocks that were there. Then in 2011, we had double-digit inflation that persisted for very long. Why? Because rural wages rose in double digits, real wages. This was unheard of because there was so much stimulus in rural areas, and this increased the demand for food, etc. And inflation became persistent. There were large second round effects. This time we are not seeing that. That is why I say the inflation is driven by multiple supply shocks, and Indian inflation is much lower than US. And it's much closer to our target. It did exceed our target in the last year, but only by 1%. So it's coming, and it's already back in the target band, in the tolerance band. So it's a little higher than the target, which is 4. And we have a flexible inflation targeting. That means that you're okay if it's in the tolerance band, which also helps. You don't have to immediately tighten in response to us. You can allow supply side shocks to work through. So I would say that our monetary fiscal policies were also intelligent, and for example, I know somebody I know in Europe who runs an NGO, and they got such fat checks from the government. His company had shut down, so he was using the check to travel the world or something. But here people were saying there's too little support for SMEs because of these budgetary supports. So what happened was that we did not create zombie SME. So your point about women and informalization, another criticism made was informal sector is killed. The government has not supported. This is a large part of the Indian economy. So there were predictions that that real growth is going to be negative in the second year, and then when you had high positive growth in between the recoveries, this was a surprise. It was an outperformance given these predictions. So I would say that the Indian economy, because like TN used to say that poor can't afford to be unemployed, they did not get that sort of support, so they were forced to be resilient. And very often, you're right, women were, and then digitization, availability of global platforms to sell, produce, etc. They were forced to be innovative and to make use of what opportunities there are. And I think this helped the economy. In fact, because there's very little data here and huge heterogeneity across the country, over the last couple of years, I've been going for a lot of these events organized by MSMEs to learn what's happening. So it's all anecdotal. There's some research beginning. For example, the government made a credit warranty available. So there's research which shows that those who used this did better, and that maybe 30% exited or restructured or died, but the rest are found opportunities. And that formalization, for example, the GST and better data, the fintechs are are lending more easily to. So there's a lot of financial innovation also, which is helping. And you're right about this, and then entrepreneurs, the diversification in the financial sector, the availability of venture capital, equity funds, so on. And when I said that the diversity in India, the reason we are a large economy, US is also a large economy, but it is so highly developed that the sectors are largely correlated. In India, there's less correlation. So agriculture can perform very differently from manufacturing and so on. So this, and the advantage, this is the advantage of transition, right, which happens in all economies, that agriculture productivity rises, people are released, and the share of manufacturing, and India's case, services, we've done badly in terms of increasing manufacturing. You're trying to remedy that now. But another factor, the reason India is doing better, is we're seeing huge growth in second and third tier cities. Again, this was helped by the lockdowns. A lot of people went back to their local areas, and internet is there everywhere. They could continue working. So you're seeing a big real estate boom. This real estate was in the doldrums over the 2010s, recovery then. It's also following on reforms, RERA and so on, the reforms undertaken. So continuing reforms that are improving the supply side, improving regulation. I think I'll stop there. And maybe you can come back later, but now let's go to our other participants who've been waiting patiently. So Professor Bezbaruah is Professor and Head, Department of Economics, Guwahati University. He has 5 papers, 50 papers in 5 books, 50 papers in journals, a large number of articles, and has also worked in many policy positions. He's also an expert of the EGROW Foundation. His PhD was from Guwahati University. So when we talk about diverse, and he works a lot on the northeastern economy. So when we talk about India's diversity, we'll see how this will give us. Let us hear from him how things were different in the northeast, and how this contributed to perhaps the diversity and the response. Yeah, Professor Bezbaruah.
Okay. First of all, I must thank EGROW Foundation and in particular Dr. Charan Singh for giving me this opportunity to be in this very, I think, very important panel discussing a very important issue. And as I already mentioned, it's a pleasure to be, in a session where my former teacher is chairing the session. And Dr. Ghani, of course, I have heard you several times on these kind of sessions, and you have always been very bringing in refreshing ideas and all. That's very interesting. And having my friend Bijoy Singh in the panel, of course, gives me a lot of sense of sort of comfort, so that he's there. Okay, I'll come to that. What Madam has asked me to do about talk about diversity and all, I'd like to do it, but since we are asked to, give our perspective on this particular issue. Let me spend some time discussing this. Briefly, I'll do that and try to bring in the Northeast perspective a little bit, which you have asked me to do. Can I take about 10 minutes or so, I believe? Can we?
Yes, please.
Okay. Now, I'd like to go back to a little bit on the global, this impending crisis. For reason is that everybody is assuming that the crisis is a must, but there is an alternative also, that it may actually not work out so badly. We all know that this is because of high inflation leading to a cost of living crisis. Because both fuel and food prices are high, and of course this can degenerate into a risk of sort of global recession and that sort of things. And the causes we all know, I mean, basically three causes are identified. One is that the COVID period over expansion and all that. Then we have this war, of course, Russia and Ukraine war, and distorting the value chain and particularly energy supply to Europe. And of course the Chinese slowdown because of their, primarily because of their zero COVID policy and frequent lockdowns and all that. In this context, I'd like to say that we all know that central banks all over the world actually are raising their, I mean, they're trying to squeeze in the money supply by raising the rates, trying to do the demand side. But actually, this inflation being also supply driven, supply side factors is caused largely by supply side factors also. I mean, it's a big challenge for the world, and how the supply side management can be improved. For instance, energy, for instance, I mean, and if you look at the whole crisis, the epicenter of the crisis is Europe rather than USA or India or something like that. What we find actually is that nothing much they can do about this energy situation in a matter of months or quarter. But I think it's in the longer term, they will obviously look for greater energy security. And recently, I don't know if you have heard that, there has been some important breakthrough in nuclear energy. They might actually move away from Russian gas, dependence on Russian gas, and more on nuclear and other forms of energy. So this could be taking some time, but at the same time, you never know. The way COVID vaccines were, sort of developed very quickly as a crisis. Now, because of this energy crisis, the nuclear thing research can be expedited, and this might come out a little more quickly than we are expecting. Then one and a few more things which can turn positive. Actually, let's think of that. This war, which Putin's war, is not actually being very popular. What we get from the feedback from Russia ground levels, these are becoming rather gradually unpopular. So how long Putin is going to sustain this war? So this war may come to the end, as the winter sort of progresses and all. And if it comes to an end, actually, this will be a great relief for the whole world. And actually, we may not dip into that serious kind of a crisis. Chinese policy, for instance, it's already changing under popular pressure. They are already softening on lockdown and all that. So that kind of the Chinese angle can also be taken care of, and central banks are already working. So if the crisis, hopefully the crisis can soften a little, and in that case, of course, it will be good thing for, like Mr. Charan Singh said, Dr. Charan Singh said, everybody should be well off, not only India and all that. It's not that India should be happy and the rest of the world should be sad, right? Now, if you come to India, I mean, before I come to this crisis again, if we look at India's history in the last 75 years after independence, there are two things which are very noticeable. One is that whenever we got into a particular crisis, we have been able to turn it into a sort of opportunity. I'll mention two, and of course, whenever we had this global situation worsening, infecting everywhere, there we have also been able to escape rather, with some minor scratches and all that. So, I mean, you may assume that there is something Hindu or Indian, which enables India to do it. Actually, if you look at the specifics, there are interesting situations. So I mean, it's a little old to talk about the food crisis of 1960s, all right? But then, but India has turned it into out of this crisis, India has become a food surplus country. And today we didn't have any problem in the COVID time regarding food supply, at least. Now, how did it happen actually? It was in a way a stroke of luck because of this discovery of, I mean, the development of those what we call the seeds, high-yielding variety seeds. But at the same time, there were smart policies which were adopted by government. So you have to give credit to the government. But the third thing is that, our previous work, I think Dr. Charan Singh was mentioning that, previous work, because India in the second plan actually invested a lot in developing irrigation, that has really helped. Okay. Similarly, in the 1991, balance of payment crisis also, I mean, India could come out because India had the courage to sort of take up this plunge into this wide-ranging reforms. But India also was facilitated by things that the global environment was quite sort of conducive. Trade was becoming freer. The funds were available, capital was available, technology was available. IT has come in, and again our past work, because of our education system or whatever, we had a whole pool of rich human resource. So all these factors actually help India to turn those crises into advantages. And the other two things, I think this is something to do with India being a democracy. So everything is sort of, debated publicly and all that. So the democratic spirit, maintaining that is very important. I'd like to give you this example. After very successfully implementing, current account convertibility, there was a lot of debates going around in India in the 1990s. So how fast should you go for about capital account convertibility? But there was a lot of debates, criticism on both sides and all that. So government has to listen to both sets of arguments, and we had actually did not go overboard regarding this, and that actually have literally saved us from falling into the sort of the East Asian crisis, which was largely there in the late 1990s, right? And if we talk about the global financial crisis of 2007 and 8, then also I think we had because the banks and the financial sectors were deregulating in US and all, whereas we had in the last 10 years we have strengthened our prudential norms and all those kind of things, as a result of which our financial sector, of course, was practically unaffected by the whole crisis. And of course, there was a global recession. Some effect has to be there because India was already globalized. So we got away with some slowdown rather than having where rest of the world, most of the world, Europe and North America had a recession. Now coming to the present situation, what kind of situations do you have that India can to hope that India can escape the whole thing? I think basically we all know that India has this energy, for instance. Energy is one of the critical issue in this, but India's, I mean, basically India is not dependent on that kind of, I mean, it's in the summer only we require more energy, our energy demands are high, and energy sources are also very diversified. Now we are also using a lot of Russian supplies. So that way, I think India has basically escaped that energy, shortage kind of, or breakdown in the energy source thing. And food grains, if you look at again, food, although because of distribution and the COVID time, the food stocks have somewhat declined, but it is still very large, so that we can actually it's much larger than managing the what you call the buffer stock. And so I think there is very little risk on that we will not be able to sort of give relief to the poorest of our section if inflation sustains for some time. Then of course we all know that Indian economy is domestic economy is the major part. Basically only 20% of our total demand comes from export and all that. Of course, export is facing some difficulty. So basically, because of these things, we are quite insular. I mean, these are our strengths. I think this is something of our strength, and of course. Now we have some difficulty in the external sector, obviously because of flight of capital and whatever. Our currency has depreciated from against the dollars. That has created some problems. Normally depreciation would have increased exports, but now this time around it's not going to happen because all over the world there is some kind of demand sort of shrinkage and all that. So this is not going to increase exports, whereas our imports are going to become, which are fairly inelastic, are going to become more expensive. Then our external debts may become a little, payment may be a little more burdensome, because I think 50% or so of our debts are dollar denominated. So there is one problem here. But on the whole, if you ask me, I mean, basically, I think if you take all factors into consideration, India cannot escape this. If there's going to be a serious downturn, I don't think India can able to escape that. But then probably India will, get by with a minor, some amount of slowdown, obviously, that we probably cannot escape. But then I think it's not. Dr. Ghani has also pointed out, and I also would like to add here that if we believe that everything is very honky-dory, there are fundamental problems in the Indian economy, and one has already been mentioned. That is that large part of the economy is unorganized or informal in the nature. And in the COVID time, there are a lot of studies to show that this unorganized people who are engaged in the unorganized sector, they actually suffered serious income loss. I mean, unemployment employment situation has rebounded, but at the same time, it's not very sure that income situations have improved. And I think it's a big challenge for Indian economy. We need to address this issue, that we need to sort of have a convergence of the organized and the unorganized sector. There's a huge difference between these two sectors. How do you do it? How do you formalize the economy is the biggest challenge. So I think this is, apart from the global thing, this can give a very strength and more equitable, sort of development process in Indian economy. How do you do it? Is a matter of challenge, matter of debate. We need to have another ways. People say labor laws, land laws need to be reformed. And of course, formalization has taken place to some extent because of GST. And Madam also mentioned that there has been digitization, UPI use, and all that. So this is bringing in the informal sector also to some extent formalization. But there more need to be done. The gap between these two sectors need to be bridged. Labor laws need to be reformed, perhaps. Now, very important thing here is that just passing the acts is not easy. I mean, these are the laws which are going to be very controversial, contentious. So actually implementing them will require a lot of political acumen. If you have the parliamentary majority, that is good enough for passing the laws, but implementing them is, I mean, if you have to learn something from the farm bill, I all along supported the farm bills. I think they were the best possible legislations for the agriculture sector. Incidentally, my research area has been mostly agriculture. But then we have seen what has happened to those laws, because there is a politics or political side, political economic side of implementing this. I think this is something which need to be, we need to look into. We need to be more smarter and skillful in sort of doing this kind of things. Now, talking about the Northeast as such, if I have to say, we for a long term, it was, I'll take another 2-3 minutes to talk about that. It was felt that Northeast India actually is a very problem area for, insurgency was there, this and that, slow growing, it's isolated geographically. So those were the problems we had heard all about the Northeast. But things have changed to some extent. To some extent, it has not changed. One of the things is that, one of the point I have been making all the time is that, if Northeast is isolated geographically and all that, okay, at the same time, if you look at the Northeast as a whole, it has about 4.5 million people, which is not a very small market. So if these markets within the Northeast could sort of integrate, there can be an economy, which can be self-sustaining, hills complementing the plains, and those kind of things could have happened. But unfortunately, the Northeast also is embroiled in unending kind of identity issues. This identity issues, this group wants homeland, that group wants some SC status, that group on inner line permit, creating more barriers rather than integrating markets and so on. I think this is something which has surfaced all the time. So sometimes I become very disappointed regarding the possibility of Northeast really coming up and integrating in the global world. And if you mention that act is policy and all those kind of things, the people get very enthusiastic, but overlooking the fact that local communities many a times, many instances shows great xenophobic tendencies, which actually I don't think is very, very healthy. Just one last sentence. I'm not condemning the identity movement. I think all communities having their own culture, their languages, I mean, their identity concerns are very genuine, and their identity they need to pursue. But then this identity movement often gets generated between inter-community ill feelings. I would not say violence and all that. And also many of them want reservations and homeland. This is not going to take them forward, because if you a particular area, if you make a homeland for some particular group, the others who live in this area actually become homeless in a way. They become second-class citizens. There are a lot of documentation. But since Madam has asked, I have brought up this topic. It's a big topic. I think Professor Charan Singh one day may hold a seminar on this, identity and development in Northeast. I'm sorry, I've spoken very fast, perhaps. I'm done, basically.
Thank you. I didn't realize the time is really flying. So we're at 7:30. Is it okay if we take 15 minutes more, Charan? Yeah? Well, thank you. This is a very interesting points you made, especially that about committee form of functioning and democracy, forcing us on a middle path and avoiding dangerous extremes. I think in the 2010s, we did that extremes and we suffered. And, for farm laws, I think that they have to very carefully, again, in 2010, we suffered because of certain, like whenever you try to push reforms that affect a lot of people, there is a huge pushback in a democracy. You have to choose very carefully. And I think in India, the technology trends and so on give us a lot of areas where we can make changes, improve governance, etc., without leading into a lot of political battles. Those need to be avoided. And identity issues, communal, like I believe in the Northeast, there's a lot of improvement in infrastructure now.
There has been.
Ejaz had this book, Passions versus Interests. When you have more to lose and things are improving, some of these, you focus less on passions and more. Let's hope that happens in the Northeast.
Yes, that's what, although there has been a lot of infrastructure development, there are also barriers coming up. So Bijoy State has recently got into another inner land permit kind of thing. These are all barriers, institutional barriers coming up.
We must ask Professor Bijoykumar Singh, sorry to keep you waiting so long. So he is also an expert on the Northeast and has written lots of books, 3 books. And he teaches econometrics, microeconomics, and Indian economy. So let's hear your perspective on the Indian economy.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. First of all, I would like to thank the EGROW Foundation for giving the opportunity of sharing this platform and sharing my views on this very, very important issue. As a matter of fact, I will not claim any deep study on this particular issue, but I'm actually trying to respond to what we keep on encountering when we are exposed to the media and all that. I mean, in short, it is not really based on a very deep study. What we understand now is that we agree, there is sort of a consensus that a deep depression or a recession is going to be there, and it is going to be even worse in the next year. So I mean, if you look at all the indicators available, they indicate that this recession is going to happen. Now the big question is how India will fare when that happens. And obviously, as we understand, there are two views: the official side and also the other side. The policymakers, they are basically arguing that because India is not, very much integrated with the world economy. So what happens in the world economy is not likely to have a very, very significant impact on the developments in the Indian economy. On the other hand, there is also a view that despite this hypothesis of this decoupling hypothesis, we have had several rounds of experiences where we find that the Indian economy has not been immune to the developments in the worldwide. And this time also, when the recession comes, Indian economy is not likely to be left alone. Now, this is actually, if you look at the statistics, on the importance of various drivers of growth in the economy, what we realize is that ultimately we are actually arguing on the drivers of growth of the Indian economy. The one group is saying that the drivers of growth are rather endogenous or rather domestic factors, and the other side is trying to assert that these drivers of growth, they are also very much active across the borders. As a matter of fact, since we started this structural adjustment program in the early 90s, our integration with the world economy has been on the rise. At one time, say before that, we could claim that Indian economy was not that integrated, but now it is no longer. I mean, we can no longer say that it is like that. Now, as you see, let me cite some figures, which will really raise some big questions on the immunity of the Indian economy. So, for example, in the case of India's exports, it is basically service sector driven growth, and the U.S. market was the major destination of the Indian software exports. Now, when the U.S. actually has problems of this recession, then this is bound to affect the Indian exports also, particularly the service sectors. Then also the foreign portfolio investment also has been. We have been facing lots of outflows of this foreign portfolio investment from India, and this India, even though India's foreign exchange reserve continues to be quite high, even above $500 billion, still it is declining, and it is said to be the lowest since July 2020. Now we have the declining rupee, then the surging crude oil prices, and expectations of continuing central bank rate hike and the widening current account deficit. And these are not very good indicators, of an economy which can really stand when the crisis really comes. Now, as you mentioned, even though we are actually on the path of recovery, our gross domestic product, that actually this pandemic had actually cut a lot into our potentials, and we are actually not yet able to reach what we would have been able to reach. And regarding this price of crude oils, actually this has been rising, and recently also the OPEC Plus, they declared that they would be regularly cutting back the production of crude oil. So on this side also, we are not going to be very, very comfortable. And if you look at the data provided by the CMIE also, particularly about unemployment figures, and then the expectations about the consumers, we find that the consumer expectations also has been quite, not at par with the pre-pandemic things, and even if we look at the unemployment figures are also very, very high. The only thing, the comfort that we have is we really don't have the latest figures about poverty and what is happening on that count. Also, is not very well looked into. Now, so therefore, if you look at the uh, local, this thing, the domestic indicators is provided by the CMI and all that. The signs are that the economy is still yet to recover from the effects of the pandemic. Now, what I feel is that we are always talking about new normals in the case of as a consequence of the pandemic. We are forced on adopting new normals. But now, how much of that has been incorporated in our policies? That is yet to be seen. And of course, the central bank has been raising the interest rates. For quite some time, despite the fact that this time the inflation is more of the supply side base. And this making the funds costlier by raising the interest rate may choke the growth impulses. So what I feel is that we actually we are yet to recover from the pandemic, and the response of the various factors of the sectors of Indian economy in general. So, for example, we talk about the informal sector and formal sector, dichotomy. Now, actually we are yet to understand very properly how the informal sector had responded to the disruptions by the pandemic. So in other words, what I would like to I have to share is that I think that it will be very, very complacency if we say that this the global downturn is not likely to have a big impact on the Indian economy. And what is going to happen? And so that actually also depends on our understanding of the how the various affected sectors in the economy had responded and how they are recovering. Only when we understand those things, only when we understand their responses properly, then we actually would be in a position to come up with proper policies of meeting those challenges. So this much I want to share.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you very
thank
much.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it is true that we are in a very complex situation in a very complex economy. So, but policymakers have to act when they don't know everything. You have to take decisions without full information very often. So, what, like Professor Bezbaruah was saying, I think the thing that works here and that is working currently for us is that we are following a counter-cyclical smoothing volatility. We are able to do that. We have the space to do that somewhat, which is helping. And for this issue of supply side shocks and raising interest rates, what at least I've been saying, I hope they will do it, is that don't let real rates of interest rise too high. Keep both the real exchange rate and the real interest rate, which is what affects behavior. As long as that the real rate remains around 1%, then it reduces inflation, anchors inflation, but also does not hurt growth that much. We do need to contract demand somewhat because of the large current account deficit. When we have a persistent terms of trade shock, your potential output does get affected. We can't keep importing as much as we are importing, so we have to reduce demand some. Yeah, thank you. Professor Ghani, would you like to come in and make some responses to what you've heard? You're on mute. You have to, we can't hear you.
I agree with the two concerns you have raised, Ashima, that we need to follow the counter-cyclical policy and manage the external imbalances. I'd just like to add a little more detail to the counter-cyclical policy. What really matters, for sustaining high growth in counter-cyclical policies is to sustain and scale up investments in physical and human infrastructure. It's precisely scaling up the investments in physical and human infrastructure that late Prime Minister Vajpayee started with the Golden Quadrilateral Highway that brought about rural structural transformation, rise of entrepreneurship, creation of jobs, and high sustained growth. So it's just not the interest rate management by RBI, but how the other ministries sustain a fast pace of investment. On the external imbalances, India has always managed to stand, not be impacted by global financial crisis, partly because the deficit in the current account is more than made up by the remittances.
Yes.
That so India is marching ahead in the global talent race. The CEO of Google, large corporations, we are benefiting from demographic dividend and winning the global talent race. So this global talent race in which India has marched ahead will continue to provide enough, remittances and capital flows to sustain the external imbalances. The second thing, if you open up the current account deficit, is which exports, goods or services. So services generally get impacted less in global downturns. I've discussed this in my columns on Can India Withstand Global Economic Downturn, where we put more data into this. I still think that the investments being made over the last decade in physical and human infrastructure, which has accelerated the pace of rural structural transformation. I'm from Bihar, so I literally live there and I can see it. The pace of rural structural transformation, the rise of tier 2, tier 3 cities, the growth of enterprises. So the private sector, the small scale sector, the tier 2 cities, the tier 3 cities, they're all growing rapidly. The large number of women who work in the informal enterprises, and through digitization, they have become part of the global supply chain. So a lot of credit goes to them.
Yes, absolutely. I think that that is absolutely correct. Remittances. This is an example of diversity. There are some things that are going well, and for the fiscal strategy, and the central government is really focusing on infrastructure, and they have increased. But this problem of less space, high share of interest payments. But the problem is state governments are not spending. They're not spending that much. They're not spending on infrastructure as much as they should. So there's some way we have to improve the I don't know how the planning or the coordination across different levels of government, and the way finances reach the third tier, and they have more freedom to take decisions and respond to public needs. All that, a lot of work needs to be done in India. Private investment, we're seeing just the beginnings. Banks are saying that for the first time they're seeing large demand from firms, and credit rate of growth has gone up, and that suggests that maybe we're at the brink of a rise in investment. We're due for it after a decade of slowdown. So thank you very much.
May I just one final suggestion from me? This panel has focused both on macro and micro issues. Both of them are important, but somehow we need to integrate this in the growth agenda when, say, Ministry of Finance or Reserve Bank of India is deciding on the growth agenda. Let me elaborate on this. All enterprises use three factors of production: labor, capital, and land. This data is available in the annual survey of industries and the National Sample Survey for millions of enterprises in 600 districts. And we asked the question, which factor of production is most distorted in India? Is it land, labor, or capital? And distortion is by the usage of the factor and the productivity at that enterprise level. And what we found was that land is the most distorted factor in India. Inefficient enterprises manage to grab more land. The second most distorted factor is capital, and labor is the least distorted. Why is capital distorted? Inefficient enterprises which manage to grab the land can also take a loan from the bank because banks use land as a collateral. So capital also gets distorted. So pushing the agenda on land reforms and capital reforms will help scale up India's growth. So we need to build a bridge between the micro findings and the macro agenda. And this work is available. Just do factors of production, distortion in India, it will throw up the paper.
That's very interesting. So, Charan, is there anybody who has questions? Dr. Vishwandas, Charan, or comments?
There are beautiful questions in the chat box, but you take the question from Dr. Vishwandas and answer me after when you are about to close and hand over it back to me. My question is very simple. Will we escape or not escape? That's all.
Yes.
Right? But that you give us the answer at the end after you've taken question from Dr. Vishwandas, or whenever you decide to close before you hand it over back to me.
Yeah. I must say at the outset, it was a sheer delight to listen to these illustrious panelists, Ashima Goyal, Professor, the Bijoykumar, Bezbaruah, and then in particular the Ejaz Ghani. See, my very simple question, the agriculture and the digital transformation and the AI, the traditional classical theory, the Cobb-Douglas function and all those, the capital, land and labor, those are the factor of production. But in my view, the AI is another factor of production in the modern times and in the years to come, which don't have that much limitation as the capital and the labor, because they are going to supplement and AI in particular is going to have the self-propelling, because if all industries are interconnected and if one particular industry adopts the AI, the modern digital transformation, then it propels and therefore it is going to spread. Given that India is it's way ahead of many other countries in terms of the digital transformation. So I see my simple point is the past is not necessarily the indication for future how it will unfold. Second point, I mean, this is related in agriculture particular, because so many policy intervention are being taken in the recent past and is going to take, for example, PM Gati Shakti, and that is the one direct, just to give an illustration, not the only point, in 2021, India exported for the first time agriculture commodity in excess of 50 billion US dollar, and that was about 19.52% growth rate, and this was over and above the 18% in the previous year. So that shows the resilience of agriculture, and you correctly said, Professor Ghani, that rural transformation and then agriculture is also in the rural. So I see, because India's agriculture structure is very different, and it poses, for example, in COVID times, we have so much surplus that we could easily afford to give free ration, so those are the resilient point in agriculture. So my suggestion, rather my thought is, that we have to see the digital transformation, AI, because that is another factor of production which is rooted in the total factor productivity, and we have to take that factor on the board. So
it's absolutely, there is a lot of change. People are saying, but we have to be careful that we don't become too optimistic. We have to work on a lot of things and ensure things go, because we've had so many failures in India, so many disappointments in the past. So this new wave and new opportunities, there are a number of trends that favor India, but we have to make sure that we do the right things and are able to sort of effectively ride this wave. But it's true that in agriculture, people talk about poverty and so, but there are a lot of positive things happening there, I think. And now, just to touch on the questions in the chat bot, there's somebody who says that does all these problems mean globalization has failed? And if unemployment is so high in India, how can we be doing well? Whether freebies are right or not. So, there are a lot of controversies in India, but I think I would say that extreme globalization has failed. Maybe we are going to a more moderate and sustainable one. But exports and being open to the rest of the world is really important for India and important for its growth. And unemployment, yes, we are working if things go right. And entrepreneurs, self-employment, women work, finding jobs using the digital portals. So a lot of, it's not just the formal employment, there's a lot happening on that front. And finally, freebies, I think the point is that not distorting prices, but providing public goods that increase human capacity, that improve investment, as Professor Ghani was saying. So I think I'll stop there. Professor Ghani, you want to add anything before we close?
Can you give me 30 seconds, ma'am?
Okay, I think India will manage to escape the global downturn. And that's because India is following a new growth model, which was just suggested by on the artificial intelligence, the digital revolution. India has marched ahead. India's service revolution, new digital growth, very different from China. It doesn't mean that India should ignore the manufacturing sector. That will be the new source of growth, but that will happen in tier 2, tier 3 cities in UP and Bihar. So scale up the infrastructure in lagging regions.
Absolutely, we need everything in India because there's so much diversity. We can have manufacturing, services, and AI all working together. So, Charan, the answer is we will escape. Maybe we'll have a little bit, some negative impact. Instead of growing at 8%, we'll grow at 7% or 6%. But we will escape. We won't have a recession. We won't have negative growth. That is for sure. Okay.
I'm so excited.
Can I get 30 seconds, ma'am?
Yeah, please.
No, I just wanted to, it's very heartwarming to hear from Dr. Ghani regarding referring to that growth of enterprise everywhere. But we also need to recognize that many of them are very vulnerable. So how to reduce their vulnerability can be one of the big challenges if we talking about a new model. And the service sector exports, okay, some research in my department has shown that actually India's service exports were, service sector particularly exports were growing exponentially earlier. Now it is growing in a sort of, the growth rate has decelerated a little, particularly because of new competitions from other countries like Vietnam and even Saudi Arabia. So these are the 2 points I wanted to bring into the debate. Thank you.
Yes, we can't be complacent, and we have to make sure, we have to help those who are vulnerable. So I think Charan, would you like to take over?
First of all, thank you very much, Professor Goyal. It was fun listening to you. A master presentation. I totally agree with your initial remarks. Very, very good and kind that you shared those with all of us. And then, of course, all the three panelists brought in very different perspectives and very interesting. While we had two from India, and their canvas, their coverage was superb. We had Ghani from the World Bank, and I thought he gave us a very different perspective from across the ocean. I thought that was also very interesting. At the end of the day, I think we have all learned so much today, and we are ending with a very positive note. Actually, just 2 days back, I think yesterday or day before, maybe today morning, I was reading a news item where Professor Raghuram Rajan said India should consider itself lucky if it gets away with a 5% growth. And I said, of course, means India would be very lucky. Rest of the world doesn't even have that privilege and honor to record a 5% growth. Means what is what is there to doubt about it? And then I knew we are having this panel discussion today. My own feeling is that when you are in crisis, you double up your efforts and your strength. And you never come to know from where the strength emerges at that point of time. So that is why I think when the world is going to be on the slowdown, India is looking up like a bright star. And I will not be surprised, Professor Goyal, as you said, yes, we are a highly globally integrated economy. So there is a possibility we will also have a dent. We may not grow at 8 or 9% what our potential is, but we have been growing around 6.8 and all that in the last few quarters. We may average that. So there's very positive silver lining up here. Today's discussion has also shown that the economists in our country and analysts are aware where the gaps are, where the fault lines are. So once you are aware of the fault lines, it is obvious that you will put the corrective measures, the band-aid, and cement those places. So we have a year ahead to go. And if the worst is going to come in 23, 24, we still have time to prepare for it. We have the annual budget coming up. As it is, I was very happy when I noticed that in the parliament, supplementary demand to the extent of 3 lakh crore is being sought. So that means that is supporting the economy. While consumption may be suffering, investment may be suffering, if government expenditure is going up, our GDP is going to do well. So I really found that very interesting and very hopeful and supportive. And then I knew the next budget is coming, so we can hope corrective measures, things on capital expenditure which have a multiplier effect much more than the revenue expenditure, so the economy can recover. I want to thank each one of you, the participants, as well as the speakers, and of course the chair, for bringing us a very realistic picture, analyzing it granularly, and sharing with us your perspective. And at the end of the day, with the conclusion that we're going to end on a very positive note. With that, let me conclude the session here. Tomorrow by noon, you will have the recording, and I'm sure I'm going to replay it and send it to my friends. Sure, you would like to do that. Please do that. Next Friday, we have a scheduled talk by Professor Ravi Chandra Singh on economic growth and employment linkages in northeastern India. It's a book which he has released, and he's going to be giving us a talk on this book. We will be again converging, meeting next week, Friday, around 4:30. I'll send you the flyer and all the details. So look forward to meeting all of you next Friday. Hope you can all connect. And for today, once again, let me thank each one of you, the panelists and the chair, for being so articulate and clear about India's escape from the global recession. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Bye.